Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started.
By the Fire presents A Desperate Soul by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Chapter 17. Beep, beep, beep. The monitors chirped. Doctors and nurses, fully scrubbed and wearing aprons, scurried about the room saying indecipherable things to each other. They toted various instruments among themselves. A group of them were concentrated in the middle of the room, looking at or working on something, or someone. It was difficult to tell since they were on the other side of a drape, hung between two IV poles. Jacob had seen this sort of scene in television hospital dramas. He knew he wasn't watching TV, but he also didn't recall being led into an operating room. Oddly, he was standing. He was not the one on whom they were performing the operation. He looked down and saw that he, too, was wearing scrubs instead of a hospital gown. On his hands were surgical gloves, and on his face was a surgical mask. He thought for a moment. He remembered being placed on a stretcher and wheeled into the back of an ambulance. He even remembered arriving at the hospital. But things got a little fuzzy after that. He must have dozed off. He surely didn't remember dressing out for the OR, especially if he was going to be witnessing someone else's surgery. "Scalpel," a doctor said from behind the blue drape. Jacob tried to peer over the pastel hospital blue drape, but all he could see were the doctors and nurses from their shoulders up.
This is really weird, he thought. Who are they working on? Why am I even in here? How did I get in here?
He looked at the floor, gasping as he caught a glimpse of a face in his peripheral. The head of the patient was sticking out from the bottom of the drape. Shayna! She stared straight up at the ceiling. Her blonde hair cascaded over the edge of the operating table. Her skin lacked the bronze glow he remembered. Instead, it was pale as a hospital sheet. Her mouth was slightly cracked open. Her pupils so dilated they looked like black pools, thinly bordered by slate-gray irises. And, though she still had a beautiful face, it looked lifeless.
"Hey!"
Jacob yelled at the doctors.
"Hey, I think she's dead!"
They didn't acknowledge him. "Forceps!" one of the doctors said. A nurse handed the metal instrument to him.
"Hey!"
Jacob yelled at them again, but again, no response. He looked back at Shayna's face. She was looking right at him, still sickly pale.
"Loser!"
she sternly said.
"Get out of here!" "What? Wait, she's alive?"
"Suction," the doctor said. That caught Jacob's attention.
Suction? Why would they need that?
The noise of a vacuum came to life. 1,000 thoughts rushed through Jacob's mind all at once. Suddenly, he realized that he was likely standing in the very room where Shayna was having an abortion. And, if they were using a vacuum, that meant this was a partial birth abortion. Jacob had never given much thought to the abortion issue. A few of his friends, his former friends, had gotten into drunken arguments about it. They spewed their various incoherent viewpoints. As for him, he had figured that it was certainly within a woman's right to choose what she did with her own body, but somehow, at this moment in time, it did not matter to him what Shayna wanted to do with her body. It wasn't her body with which he was concerned. It was the baby's body. His baby. "Stop!" Jacob yelled. "No!" He moved quickly, darting past the drape and dodging machines, which displayed numbers and beeped. The doctors and nurses were only a few feet away, but there was so much equipment between them. It felt more like 100 yards. He finally stepped up next to the blood-covered huddle of hospital staffers. The doctor, who had just asked for the instruments, was pulling out the head of a baby. A live baby. Jacob stared, completely befuddled. The baby cried as it took its first breaths of oxygen. This hadn't been an abortion. It was a cesarean section. A sense of relief washed over him. "Congratulations, Dad," the doctor said, holding the baby so that its back and rump were facing Jacob. The doctor turned the baby around so that Jacob could see its face. The baby's eyes opened momentarily as it continued crying. He couldn't tell the baby's gender, but it didn't matter to him right now. Jacob's heart stood still as he beheld the new life. He suddenly had the feeling that his whole life was changing from this moment onward. In spite of himself, Jacob actually felt anxious, even excited at the prospect of being a new dad. "The baby is beautiful," he thought. "Wonder if it's a boy or a girl. Wait, I thought Shayna was only 3 months pregnant. Has it already been 9 months?" "Would you like to cut the cord?" a female nurse asked. He nodded, his head swimming in the surreal new world of fatherhood. The nurse walked away, presumably to get him the surgical scissors he'd be using. The other staffers wiped the baby off, placed it in some sort of carrier, and wheeled it away. The nurse returned a moment later with a pair of scissors, handing them to him. "Follow me," she said cheerfully. The nurse walked toward a windowed room outside the OR. Inside was the small carrier in which his new baby had been placed. Jacob practically skipped after her, ecstatic with anticipation. But as he went, something began to obstruct his view. Figuring it was a piece of hospital equipment that he hadn't noticed before, he instinctively ducked and put a hand up to move around it. As his hand touched it, it didn't feel like he thought. It was solid and as immovable as an anvil. Jacob quickly realized this was no piece of equipment. This thing had fingers. A massive hand slowly descended in front of his eyes. Before he could duck out of the way, it latched around his face, squeezing while completely enveloping his entire head.
"You will never see your baby alive,"
a sinister voice said, as if through a loudspeaker. Strangely, it sounded like an evil version of his own voice. Jacob grabbed at the hand in a feeble attempt to break free. It was rough and scaly. Its strength was beyond description. With one of its fingers, it pressed on the underside of his chin, clamping his mouth shut. Its palm pressed against his nose, effectively cutting off his air supply. The girth of the hand covered his eyes, shutting out all light. He could feel the tips of its cold fingers wrapping all the way around the sides and back of his head. The huge digits easily fit over his ears, dulling all ambient sound. The hand lifted him off the ground and slowly pulling him away from his baby. Jacob kicked, desperately trying to reach the floor.
Shayna's right. You are a loser,
the evil voice said. Jacob could somehow hear the voice clearly, though his ears had been covered.
No one loves you. Benz was right. You will be a deadbeat father. You are nothing like your father. You should just end it all.
And then it squeezed.
Now.
Extreme pressure compressed his head as the hand clamped down on his temple, eyes, ears, cheeks, jaw, and nose all at once. He kicked, struggling frantically in a futile attempt against the impossibly tight grip. His head felt as if it were in a 360-degree trash compactor. The pain, pressure, and suffocation grew worse until he felt that his eyes would pop like water balloons. His skull would certainly be crushed like an eggshell. This was it, he decided. These were his final seconds on Earth. He was being killed by a demon. It was strange, he thought. They couldn't actually hurt humans. Rather, they could only convince them to hurt themselves or others. Apparently, he was wrong. He heard the sickening crack of his skull shattering. He gasped and sat bolt upright. His heart pounded and his head throbbed. He was hyperventilating. There were blankets over him. An IV was sticking into his right forearm. There was something clipped to his left index finger. Reality began to set in. It had been a dream. There was no operating room, no doctors, no nurses, and no monstrous hand crushing his head. But also, no Shayna, and no baby. He looked around. He was in a hospital room. It was dark outside as he glanced through the window. The lights in the room were dimmed. The TV mounted on the wall was playing, of all things, Clerks. The thought of it being Bean's favorite movie made him sick. The sound was muted, but Jacob found the remote and turned the TV off. The hospital was quiet outside his room. No nurses or cleaning staff were shuffling by. Loneliness nearly overwhelmed him. Everything and everyone that mattered to him was gone. Mom and Dad, Grandma, the band, his friends. It was just him and the machines. Beep, beep, beep. Thank you so much for listening to By the Fire. Hey, would you do me a favor? Would you rate this podcast? Maybe go on Spotify or Apple or wherever you like to download your podcasts and just leave me a rating. 5 stars would be nice, but I want you to be honest. Also, did you know that you can support this podcast? Yes, by more than just subscribing, which, by the way, why don't you subscribe while you're at it? Anyway, go to anchor.fm/bythefirewithdave/support. It works kind of like Patreon, if you're familiar with that. Any generous financial donation you make, don't worry, I'm not going to keep it. And you can read all about that in the show notes. Thank you again, and God bless you. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.